Today I want to tell a little bit about Crusade and Revolution, published by Compass Games. This is a game about the Spanish Civil War, and well, I played some games about this topic in the past. I think it is an interesting topic. This is a game at the strategic level, and in a sense, for the overall feel, it reminded me of the Spanish Civil War by GMT, a game that I played a couple of years ago, and I enjoyed that one very much. A general sense, a general feeling in that there is a core of rules which is not too complicated, a couple of pretty straightforward concepts and mechanics around which there are extra ideas to weave in historical events, political factors and things like that. So a good balance between a straightforward, lean core of rules and still a good sense of historical feel. And I already anticipated part of my conclusions here. So the Spanish Civil War by GMT has that, and it does it in a traditional hex and counter fashion. Crusade and Revolution has that general feel too, but it achieves that using a card-driven engine. With a couple of twists, I must say, that I had not seen in previous card-driven games. Let me show you the map, let me tell about the main concepts of the game, and then I'll tell a little bit about my impressions after I played the game. This is the map for the game. It is a paper map and a point-to-point map. As you can see from the colors of the boxes that are used in the game, the areas are divided in two main groups. Pink areas, and these are areas that are used for setup of Republican units in the campaign game, and light blue boxes representing the setup position of nationalist units at the beginning of the campaign game. That is, this is pretty much the situation at the beginning of the war, with a group of nationalist units moving from here, with some pretty powerful African units joining the fight from here. We have a northern nationalist front, which is cut off from some of the supply lines. Actually, this cut off from supplies bringing ammo to that front. There is a rule that says at the beginning of the game there are limitations to nationalist attacks in this area until the south manages to make contact with the north. Then the ammo shortage limitation is lifted for the rest of the game. And we have here the Republican front. It's pretty narrow here. There are some fortifications here. Madrid, very important city there. And up there we have the isolated northern area with a lot of special rules and restrictions, because there are actually three separated Republican groups that are there defending against the pressing northern front of the nationalists. This is a card-driven game, which means that actions that the players perform will depend on cards that they will play from their hand. Each turn, the players receive a hand of cards. The nationalist player then goes first, plays a card, performs actions connected to that card, and then the Republican player does the same, and the players alternate until the end of the turn. Each player has a deck of cards, a specific deck of cards divided in three sections. The section called War of the Columns represents the early phases of the war. If you're playing the campaign game depicting the entire war, at the beginning you only use this deck. Then later in the game you also receive cards for the mobilization phase, the second phase of the war. Then you shuffle these cards together with the initial cards to form a larger deck. And then you have the War of the Armies, the later phases of the war. So, what do you do with these cards? Well, you can play the card for the number that you see here, ignoring everything else written on the card, usually, or you can play it for the event. Some events will go to your discard pile after you play them. Some are a one-time thing and they're completely eliminated after you play them. They do not come back to your deck. But the main thing in most cases, the main thing that you will be doing will be to play the card for this number here. And actually this number can be used in a variety of ways. You could play it to perform actions on the board, and that's something that you see in most, if not all, card-driven war games. But you could also use it for something else. You could, for example, play a card to receive the corresponding number of replacement points, and you simply keep a record of how many replacement points you have on a specific track, a track just for that, and at the end of the turn, you will receive those replacement points. You can also choose to spend your points from the card for strategic movement. That means that you can spend those points to move units on the board for particularly long amounts of distance. So they can cover a great distance, more than they would otherwise, but they can do that only when they are moving in areas that you already control. So if you're doing strategic movement, you can only move your units. If you are using the number for operations, then you can combine the actions, meaning you can spend them to perform moving and attacks, which is not something you can do with strategic movement. However, there are some limitations. You can't perform certain actions more than once per turn. You can't perform certain actions multiple times in a sequence. How can you remember that? Well, very easily. Each player has a set of action markers from 1 to 6. You have 6 actions each turn. After you play a card, you simply mark on this table here the type of action that you performed. Suppose that I performed an operation sequence. I spent that card for operations, then I place it there. My opponent goes. Now, the second card, I decide to play it for national reinforcements, and I place the marker there to indicate that for that turn I can't take that action anymore. Then later I want to use strategic movement, and I place it there. Well, this type of action, and together with replacement, cannot be taken twice in a row. You cannot play the same type of action in consecutive actions. So next turn, I have a 3 there. My next action must be the 4. I know that I cannot place it there. I know that I have to do something else with it. Units have a symbol indicating the type of unit, the type of combat unit represented by each counter, and they have 3 numerical values printed on them. They are in order: attack factor, life points, resistance to loss, whatever you want to call it. It is the thing that when it goes down to 0, when it is matched by losses inflicted by the opponent, you lose a step. And if you lose a second step, well, first you lose a step. If you lose a second step, the unit is removed. Back to us. Attack, life points, and movement. At the beginning of the game, players have small units on the board. If you're playing the campaign game, this is the columns after all. So you have some militia, some infantry, some cavalry, but not many such units are on the board at the beginning. Later during the game, players receive larger units. They receive course-sized units, but they have to wait. Players receive some units, such as these ones, by default in turn 5, and other larger units can be received by the players by playing event cards, by playing reinforcement cards for the reinforcement event. And some events, and in some reinforcements, you can have only if you are taking specific sequences of events. For example, you need to play as the nationalist player the Axis reinforcement that kind of opens the channel with the Axis before you can start bringing in Italian and German units. When you are playing a card for its operational value, so for the number here, you can activate a number of boxes equal to the number on the card that you're playing. In this case, I can activate 3 boxes. Then you have markers such as these ones that indicate attack and move, and you simply mark the boxes that you want to activate with the type of action that you want to perform, and that can be attack or movement. First, you resolve all of the movements. Units move along these connections. The solid lines are roads. These lines here are rivers. The shape, the type of line does not affect the movement. It does affect combat though, because attacking across certain lines gives modifiers to that benefit the defender. So first you resolve your movements. Supported, I want to bring some reinforcements towards the north, and then these guys leave the screen and they're moving. And then I resolve the attacks that I committed to. In this case, I have an attack here, and I can attack that box there. You can combine attacks from different boxes against the same opponent, against the same enemy box. That's fine. How do you resolve the attacks? Well, you look at the combat tables. There are 2 of them, and the size of the units involved in the fight will indicate the table that you use. If only division-sized units are involved in the fight, then you use this table here. You will simply take into account all of the attack factors of the defender and of the attacker. Both players roll a die and they cross-reference the attack points that they have in the fight with the result. There may be modifiers, for example, there may be combat effects, there may be column shifts based on the terrain that the attack is happening through. And, well, you cross-reference the final result with the die roll, and you have the number of loss points that you inflict on the opponent. That means that both the attacker and the defender can inflict damage on the opponent. And the damage needs to be absorbed by matching the loss point of the loss points of the opponent. I inflict a point of damage on that unit, I match the loss, and I turn it like that. Another loss would mean that the unit is removed. If the attacker manages to inflict more damage on the defender than the defender does on the attacker, then the attacker has won the battle and the defender is forced to retreat. If the difference is of 1, that is, the damage inflicted by the attacker exceeds by 1 that inflicted by the defender, then the defender retreats by 1 space. If it's more than 1 point of difference, by 2 spaces. Also, players may have cards that are combat cards and that can be played during the battle, right before the battle, to generate specific effects, to give each other, well, not each other, to give modifiers. Well, it can be modifiers that benefit you or affect the opponent directly. There is a variety of modifiers that players can receive. What is interesting, and it's pretty original, I haven't seen that in many games, if you have a combat card that gave you a good modifier in a fight and you win the battle, you keep the card unless there's a specific instruction that says that you need to remove the card to discard it immediately. You keep the card in front of you and you can use it in multiple battles that turn. At the end of the turn, even if you won all of the battles in that turn, it needs to be discarded. But basically, if you play a card in a battle and you win the battle, you keep it in front of you either until the end of the turn or until you lose a battle. That means you may benefit from the advantage of the card for several battles, which is neat. I haven't seen that in other games, I think. If a box is activated for movement, the player can also use a unit in the box, imagine there's a unit there, to try to build a position, which is a defensive structure that gives benefits to the defender when a battle happens against that box. A small unit can attempt to build a position. You need to roll a die to see if you're able to do it. A larger unit, a division size unit, builds a position automatically. A box that has a position can also be activated for movement, and then a unit in the box can attempt to upgrade the position to a trench, which gives even better defensive advantages. In particular, it gives the advantage to cancel a retreat by taking an extra damage, an extra point of damage. A small unit needs to roll a die to see if it can upgrade the position into a trench. A larger unit can do that automatically. Another important concept is supply. Units need to be able to trace a line of supply to a supply source. That symbol indicates a supply source. Supply can be traced by land. There are ways to trace it also by sea. There are several ways, and you need to be careful because units that end up out of supply suffer terribly crippling effects. It's not just like, oh, they act a little less than they would do otherwise. They can do virtually nothing. You cannot activate them by spending operation points. They cannot receive replacements. They can do just nothing. They can only sit there and wait for somebody to come and save them. And if they are still out of supply at the end of the turn, then they are eliminated. At the end of the turn, well, after the players have placed all of their actions using cards, you do have the attrition phase when you check supplies. Then you have the war status phase in which you check to see if one of the players won the game. And to win the game, the nationalist player needs to get out of victory points and to reduce the morale of the Republican player. There are these two factors that change throughout the game. They change based on control of key locations on the map, based on the play of specific events, based on other circumstances that may affect things. If neither of the two players won the game at that point, then you have the replacement phase when players can rebuild units or replace points that were steps that were lost. So you can bring back units that were destroyed or simply heal units on the map that were reduced. And then if at that point, after you spend your replacement points, the turn is over and players repeat the sequence. Draw cards, actions, attrition, war status, replacement. First things first, I know that many of you are always interested in knowing whether a game is solitaire friendly or not, because it's hard to find players, especially when it gets to long games and complicated games. This is very solitaire friendly. It's card driven, but there are only a couple of cards that do not work fully well. When you're playing the game solitaire, you're playing both sides to the best of your possibilities. Much better it is the fact that you have limited intelligence because you do not know what cards are going to be drawn next turn. You do not know what the opponent is going to do. It plays very well solitaire. If you play the campaign game, it's very long, which is also one of the reasons why you may want to set it up on your desk and you do not have to worry about, well, when your other opponent is available if you're playing a very long game. The campaign game takes a while to play, but it's fun. It's really, really good. And here we get to the main point. I love the twists and tweaks that one can find to the traditional card-driven engine. I love the balance between elegance of certain situations, elegance of certain rules and mechanics, and yet a great level of historical depth. I really found that the game does encourage you to play along historical lines. If you get tired of that after a while, there are many optional rules in the playbook that you can adapt, that you can use to adapt the game to suit your needs. I personally love games that do encourage you to work and think along historical lines. And this is a game that still is full of options. There are just so many ways in which you can go. Especially at the beginning of the game or the campaign game, both players have a lot of priorities. And before I can tell you about that, I have to put a little bit of a disclaimer. There's a lot I didn't cover in this review. I want to show the main concepts, the core mechanics, but there's a lot that I couldn't cover because there are a lot of specific rules that cover specific situations, cards that have an effect on that card, that has an effect on that unit, which has an effect on that thing, da 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 da. There are a lot of these things. It can even get a little disorienting at the beginning. The rulebook is both very simple and kind of complicated. The core rules are very simple, then you have to memorize a lot of cases, a lot of situations. It can get a little tough. I would rate the complexity intermediate, but if you just get the main concepts, you start playing and you kind of learn about the specific situations as you go. You won't be playing optimally the first time, but it's a more fun way of learning the game than otherwise. Back to the main concepts, you have many options precisely because there are many historical situations that have been woven into the game, especially when it comes to the setup and the initial goals of the campaign game. There are some small groups of nationalist soldiers that are sieged, and the Republican player is trying to win the sieges to get rid of them. The nationalist player is trying to remove the ammo shortage limitation. The North has its own special rules, and the nationalist player can try to push against that. There's a part where the northern front is kind of narrow, and the Republican player may try to close that gap to create a pocket where a lot of nationalist units will be caught. The southern coast, the Republican player can try to defend that to the last man, or can simply try to give that up and to move the front line a little back and look for good positions to defend among the mountains. There are just many objectives that the players may want to try to achieve, and that the game encourages them to achieve. The card engine is fun because you will never be able to activate all of your units. You have to concentrate your efforts, you have to choose your battles, and you have to choose how you use the cards. Fight a lot, you find yourself without reinforcements, with your troops spent, get a lot of replacements, that's great, but in the meanwhile your troops have been slaughtered, so the replacements just fill in the gaps. You have to find a balance between the many possible uses of the cards. This is a game of great complexity, in the sense of all the nuances that it has, all the facets that it has. I loved it immensely. Frankly, I will go all the way to say this. I'm filming this at the end of May, and this is possibly, most likely, the best war game that I played in 2014. The year's not over yet, but that's a good game. That's still a good game, and I endorse it all the way. I loved it, and I think that if you like war games, there are good chances that you will like